Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. March 1st marks the 1 year mark of Tan Sri Yassin being sworn in as the 8th Prime Minister of Malaysia. This after the parliamentary coup that ousted the Pakatan Harapan government, infamously known as the Sheraton move. Now, in the past year, Malaysia has had to grapple with the triple threat of health, political and economic crises. How has the Perikatan National government fared in this 1 year, in its first year? Joining us on the line now to help assess the government's report card, we have political scientist Dr. Wong Huat. Let's begin with a broad assessment, Huat, in terms of Perikatan Nasional's performance. Now, there is no manifesto as such for us to be able to benchmark their promises or their pledges to hold them to account. So how would you go about in terms of benchmarking their performance this past year?
This is extraordinary time because of the pandemic. To be fair, I think any government would have a tough time to figure out how to do it. But of course, if we compare countries like New Zealand, then we can see a very consistent, very clear leadership in managing both the pandemic and the economy. And what is interesting is that the New Zealand government under Jacinda Ardern until last year election, was a minority government. And the minority coalition government that runs the country so well that it stays top on different measures of country performance. And so coming back to Malaysia, when we look at how Perikatan Nasional Plus, the Perikatan Nasional Plus government performs, we find that it has been over-occupied by its own survivor, so much so that when we look at the pandemic policy, in many ways the measures are not properly thought out. We see government flip-flops on the measures. To be fair, as I say earlier, it's not going to be easy, but if you have a government that has put all its focus on managing the pandemic, it would have been much more consistent. And we are not seeing this. We find often the planning was not properly done, but much worse is the enforcement. We find SOPs get shifted when you involve VIPs. So sometimes purely in enforcement, sometimes by changing the policy. For example, when we look at what happened in the Sabah state elections, when VIPs were given shorter time of quarantines, recently that after Prime Minister visit to Indonesia, that cabinet ministers are asked to only be in quarantine for 3 days. So that's one part of the problem. The other part, of course, it has to do with budget. This is a time that you need a government to make bold decisions, and bold decisions can only be made when you have a cross-partisan support. In other words, parties need to put aside narrow partisan interests to come forward for common solutions. But we are not seeing an inclusive policy-making process. The budget is basically drafted with little opposition participation. So this would have been, if the government has been focusing on this, then we should see much bolder measures to help, not just saving people's life, but also public livelihoods. But this is unfortunately not happening in the full force. Instead, we still have issues of misallocations of public funds for staff that for matters that of low priorities, like building community halls in the Prime Minister constituency.
When we look at Perikatan Nasional on the federal level, despite threats to its hold on power, it has managed to stay in power. Perhaps that's probably one measure of its success. But when you look at the state level, we have actually kind of mixed landscape. We have them taking control in Sabah, but losing other states, including to its own coalition partner, as it were, in Perak. But how do you assess this other level, the state level, in terms of Perikatan Nasional?
I would revisit this assessment that the government is successful, at least at the federal level. What we are seeing is a very tricky position. There is a negative majority against the Prime Minister. It's very obvious now, even after the hopping of two PKR lawmakers. Muhyiddin still has only 110 in the House. We are seeing a very tricky situation. The government has lost openly two UMNO MPs, Ahmad Jaslan and Nasri Aziz. And anytime it may actually lose more from UMNO, and courting PKR defectors or PH defectors would not solve that problem, because UMNO overall has 38 seats. So if 30 of them jump over, decide to pull out from the government, how many can you pull from PH to save yourself? But what is tricky is that there is only a negative majority against Muhyiddin as the Prime Minister, but there is not a positive majority for the successor. In other words, if there's going to be a vote of no confidence, that would be a simple vote of no confidence to oust the Prime Minister, but there would not be, they would not agree on who should be the successor. That makes the government in a situation why it can survive at, that explains why the government can survive at the federal level, but not at the state level, because at the state level, deals were clearly struck in Perak and even Johor between UMNO and PH. And that's likely going to happen during or certainly after the next election.
So Chinwat, I was reading with interest, and I wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit, and take a look at what happened a year ago that led us to this situation. And you wrote recently an opinion piece about the 6 positive outcomes from the Sheraton move last year, some of which I found to be very interesting. I'm wondering if you could just kind of go through that very quickly, particularly the bits about some of the consequences. Like now we have UMNO speaking about reform. Now we have the end of this myth around Malay unity. Could you very quickly go through some of those?
Sure. What we have seen before the Sheraton move is a perception or propaganda that the Malays are under threat because the Malays did not constitute a majority in the PH government, and therefore they're losing power. They were losing power. With PH with Perikatan Nasional Plus coming into power, then that government was 85%, was 95% Bumiputra and 85% Muslim. So, and out of 6, let me see, was it? Out of 6, 1, 2, 3. Sorry, sorry, let me count again. 3, 4, 5, 6. Right. Out of 7 Malay majority party, Muslim majority, out of.
Yes, 7. You're right. 7,
right,
I think.
right.
Yes.
Out of 7 Muslim-dominated Malay parties, 4 in the government now. So you should see the governments to come together to show that how Malay unity is at work. But the only thing that you see is now that but what happened is that the 3 main Malay parties, that is UMNO, Bersatu, and PAS, they were bickering almost non-stop, especially between UMNO and PAS. And why? Because these are like 3 brothers going after the same love interest. So the moment they fend off their opponents, their other rivals, they start fighting to get the attentions and the love of this lady, which is the Malay voters. And so you have a situation, they start focusing on this, and a direct outcome of that is also that For example, okay, so we come down to these three parties. Out of the three parties, PAS has every interest to protect Bersatu because Bersatu is the weakest, to prevent UMNO from regaining dominance and then going to curve PAS own growth. PAS would have to support Bersatu. That leaves UMNO gradually moving away from this Malay unity narrative. Because they realized that their main rivals would be Bersatu and PAS, and less of PH. So you see them now talking about moderations, talking about reform, and these are good things because it doesn't matter whether a party seriously believes in this, in all this good stuff like moderations and reform, as long as they actually pay some lip service to it, it actually changed the narrative as well. Now, the other unintended consequences, the other unintended consequence of Sheraton's move is that instead of Malay unity, you find that Malays now become much more critical of inequality. We talk about dual darjat because the VIP and ordinary people have two sets of law, two sets of policies, and now even coming down to even vaccination. And so at the end, more than before, if equality in the past is seen as a non-Malay demands on Malay, now it is something that Malays are complaining, Malays are demanding among themselves. So this is good for the long-term developments of a country because we would be talking about rule of law and other things.
Chinwat, is the other sort of victim of the last year's, messy politics really the narrative about democracy and reform? Because as you talk about lip service, it seems like many, stalwarts and democratic demagogues, seem to have cast away their values very quickly and embrace power without any kind of agenda. So could there be an increasing cynicism as a consequence of this elite power play that Malaysians are subjected to almost on a daily basis?
Yes, that certainly is a threat. That in fact what we are seeing clearer now than ever before, that our politics is all about fight over positions. Because the current system has always been that way, but we're just not seeing very clearly. Our elected representatives fall into three classes. The minister and deputy ministers who get the largest power and patronage. Then you have the government backbenchers who get some crumbs. And then you have oppositions who are left in the cold. And all these defections, what we are seeing is that people try to upgrade themselves. Opposition lawmakers joining government in the hope that they become minister, deputy minister, or at least government backbenchers. Government backbenchers installing new government in the hope that they become minister, deputy minister, and minister toppling their own government to become senior minister. We are seeing all these changes happening without much about policy. So that's bad, and that's caused a lot of people to lose faith on politicians. Perfectly understandable. Unfortunately, that is not the solution, because by giving up on politics, we would only make it easier for politicians to grab power and grab position. We are not offering any solution. What we need is to have,
All right. Chino, very quickly, I want to ask you, we're looking at the performance of the Perikatan Nasional government in the past year. I'm wondering, could you look at the Pakatan Harapan government's performance as opposition in the past year? Have they done enough to convince the people that perhaps things might have been better had they been in power?
Unfortunately, not at all. I think this is the part that Pakatan Harapan has to blame itself than even the government, because they have the largest number as opposition, both PH and PH+. But we have not seen a shadow cabinet. We have not seen even a shadow budget last year. We have heard criticisms on how the governments have done wrong, but we have not seen how they show us they can do better. And I think they contribute to the loss of faith of voters as well on politics. And what they should do now is to really get back to business and show us what differences they can make. This is a bad time. This is a bad time to be government. But unfortunately, the opposition is not seizing the opportunity. If they do, then it would actually will help to stop people from hopping, because they can then project some hope of coming back into power.
Huat, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We appreciate your time and your insights. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but back with more on this topic. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our assessment of the Perikatan Nasional Government's one-year report card. Bridget Welsh is with the Asia Research Institute at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Bridget, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, you wrote a recent opinion piece, and this was on the one-year mark of the Sheraton move. And in that piece, Bridget, you said that 1 year later, political elites haven't actually moved on from this numbers game. The leaders are still concentrating on what you call a numbers game. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think there's been a lot of focus on having the numbers, and with the health crisis and the economic crisis, the COVID-19 has perhaps somewhat obscured what has been lost with all this focus on having the numbers. What do you think?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the politicians seem to be focused on themselves as opposed to focusing on the broader issues that are facing the country. And so, you can see even, yesterday, 1 year before, on the anniversary, there's now 2 more defections. And of course, defections don't happen out of nowhere. They talk about people trying to secure political support and shore up their political support. And, this takes away from the attention to dealing with the more fundamental crises that the country is facing. In a piece that I have coming out, I argue that this last year, we've seen a situation where the country has wasted this crisis. It's wasted the ability to use this opportunity to engage in more fundamental reforms. This means fixing the healthcare structure and systems. It means addressing the underlying economic problems, which involve the middle income trap, and moving away from a system that is paralyzed by a kind of nexus between politics and business, and as well as actually addressing the problems within political parties, which are sort of stuck in the leadership of the past that are focused on themselves as opposed to the positions of ordinary people in Malaysia.
Bridget, to what extent do you think even the opposition, as well as leaders within Perikatan, are trapped by their perceived sense of public sentiment? Meaning, the ability to be generous or to build bridges, having, as it were, betrayed each other at some point in time. Is that stopping them from thinking of new ways of governing, of finding a new consensus?
I think there are 2 things going on. First of all, older leaders are not letting go. So their ambitions are really sort of wrapped up in the political process. And even some of their mentors are also equally ambitious. So the focus is on just winning power. And the parties themselves do not provide an arena for new ideas, for new elites to emerge from within it. And so they're caught. It's not as if they don't see the problems, they do. But the older leaders are not letting go. And that is a real challenge. The second issue is that the politicians, think that they're the solutions to the country, that they are entitled to positions, and they're entitled to actually having a control in particular ways. The whole idea of public service is not really ingrained. And this is shifting, but the fact is that it's not shifting among the political elites. There is still a very entrenched view of entitlement. And unfortunately, even when the opposition, Pakatan Harapan, went into government, they also took away the sense of that they're entitled to their positions as well. So not all of them, but many of them. And so this is a very difficult thing to move away from.
Bridget, we posed this question to Chin Huat a little bit earlier because, again, Perikatan Nasional, when the Perikatan Nasional government came into power, it didn't come with a manifesto. It didn't make promises or pledges that we can hold them to account. How would you benchmark the success and failures of the Perikatan Nasional government in the past year? I mean, if you strip away the pandemic, how would you measure the success of this administration?
I think you need to look at specific opportunities that they have and how they've used those opportunities. The fact is that for the first 3 months that Muhyiddin Yassin came into office, he had space to actualize and engage in a whole series of initiatives. And what happened is that opportunity was wasted for many areas. So they could have expanded the social safety net. In fact, they returned to the same old model of politicizing issues of social safety net policies. It could have introduced a new set of economic reforms in terms of talking about increasing transparency, more competition in the economic sectors, thinking about how to use the limited resources to make some very difficult cuts that were necessary towards certain sectors of the economy and spending towards others. So when we look at these issues, we have to look at how other countries have managed crises, have used crises as a political opportunity. And Malaysia has not. And I think the benchmarks don't come from within Malaysia. They come from global experiences or regional neighbors. So when we think about Malaysia, we think about how the fact is that Indonesia and Vietnam have had significant more economic growth and more FDI than Malaysia had. And this is a role reversal that Malaysia has actually had in the past. Or we look at the issues of pandemic management, compare Malaysia to Singapore or Thailand, its immediate neighbors. And I'm not saying that the Muhyiddin government did not do some things well. And I think in the global perspective, there are a lot of things that Malaysia can stand tall to. But at the same time, we have to look at the fact that the region is changing and Malaysia's position, comparative advantage in the region is changing. And those are the benchmarks that I think are very important to look at. Because if you look inward in Malaysia, as opposed to look outward, you see a very different story.
Bridget, do you think the last year is going to be a reflection or is set a template for the coming years? And I don't mean just another year, but perhaps several electoral cycles going forward. That this fragile coalitions with very little of an agenda and perhaps distributing as much largesse in order to secure support is going to be a feature of Malaysian politics for many years to come.
It's hard to say, Sharaad. I think in the sense that there's no question that the country is in a period of transition. We can argue that this period from 1999 through 2020, which was a period where the genesis of politics was about either co-opting or dealing with issues of reform. Now, in this year, what we've seen is that the issues of reform no longer have the same traction that they did in the past. It's going to be very difficult for any politician from across the different spectrums to kind of say, I'm a reformer, because in this year we've seen such a reversal and such hope dissipate as a result over the issues of reform. But that doesn't mean that the politics isn't changing. It's changing so much that there is a constant readaptation to the new environment, to the new alliances, to the new narratives. And I think in this crisis, there is the potential genesis of new things to be born, but it won't come from the older system. And we're now at that crux point where we see the older system and it's failing so obvious that it's going to, in a sense, plant the seeds for a different transformation. And it won't just be about coalition politics or new alliances. It will be about new narratives of political life.
Bridget, can you explain a bit about that? I'm very curious to know. I mean, what do you see emerging in terms of new narratives?
So in this one juncture, for example, is that everyone says this is about Malay politics. It's about a Malay government. You see a situation where it's a dominance and exclusion of other communities. And this is clearly the case in terms of what we've seen this last year. But at the same time, it's also been a failure of that, showing that it's not necessarily working the way it needs to move the country forward. So out of that is more open discussions about race and religion than we've seen in a long time. Now, where it's going to go, Melissa, I can't tell you, but what I can see are the processes are changing. A second arena is that there is now more fundamental discussions of policy, open discussions of policy and debates of policy in unprecedented form. We also see a situation where, while there have been serious attacks on journalists and concerns about freedom, that also the public has stood up and said, hey, that's not what we want, whether or not it's giving money to Malaysia Kini or whether or not it's carving out their own space into sets of discourse. And so the politics has moved away from the politicians. It's been about the experience of embracing the different types of issues that the country are facing. And in that are the seeds. I can't say exactly how it's going to grow, but I do see a very different type of species of politics in Malaysia, which in fact, I think, despite, I would say, a lackluster year, a year of what I call stasis and lost opportunity, there is also in this particular period of barren politics, the possibility of new life.
Bridget, I mean, just in the very short term, there's the discussion about when Parliament opens and what will happen with that scenario. What do you see? I mean, looking into your crystal ball, what do you see potentially happening in the short term?
Well, I think we also need to know that the predictions are never good in politics these days. But in this context, I would say that the problem is that the practices of the past are so embedded. It's not a coincidence that immediately after there's an announcement that there should be a parliament, then there are more defections. And more, enticements for moving political people across, and there is clearly internal squabbling. So what I see likely is that there is going to be a call to assess the numbers, and others saying, well, we will reassess the numbers, and others will say we'll need elections. And these things have been said so many times before. So my sense is that we're going to see a continuation of those narratives. And in that, you're going to see a continuation of the practices, which is, I think, Muhyiddin Yassin has shown in his first year of office that he's capable of using the levers of power and the positions and perks of power to stay in office. And I think he comes into whenever parliamentary session with that advantage, especially since the COVID-19 is not over and has provided good cover for Muhyiddin Yassin's government. So I think I see, looking at Parliament, unfortunately, more of the same. I wish I was, from a perspective of improved governance, I would say, there's a shadow cabinet, there's an opposition is able to resolve its differences and present a platform, or that the PN government offers a different set of plans that are more holistic. These are things one would hope for, and one still holds reserve in hope to have those. But at the same juncture, they don't seem to be on the immediate short-term horizon.
Bridget, if the country does see a general election in the next 12 months or so, what do you think will make this elections different from others in terms of a political play? Not so much rather the pandemic, but with the political configuration that we have now, the political climate, how do you see them going into general elections?
So parties will be much weaker. So they don't have the same machinery. They don't have the same resources. There's much more competition. There's much more fragmentation. So I think that we will see in the rural areas and the poorer areas the use of the old measures of resources to try to win them over, and the politics of familiarity will give an advantage to traditional parties that have bases in those areas. I think on the urban areas, you're going to be looking more attention to candidates away from individual parties. You're going to see a situation where there's going to be perhaps more apathy in the political process, which especially among younger voters. And from a broader political perspective, you're going to see new looser alliances, which will allow the parties to have more choices to see how the results end up to position themselves. I don't see the same kind of two-party politics that we've seen in two-party alliances that we've seen in the past. I see a looser, more flexible alliance relationship, which will allow for more flexible alliances coming afterwards, which will not necessarily satisfy the voters from perspective of clarity. And I've long said that elections don't solve the country's problems, they reflect them. And I think in some ways we're going to see some of that as things move forward. But the nature of politics is shifting because the parties are weaker and the leaders and the views of politicians have also changed.
Bridget, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We appreciate your time.
Most welcome.